Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring two arenas where human risk is often on display. The first is war. Sadly, as we know from places like Ukraine, war is still very much a feature of the world today. The second is politics. My guest, Dr. Mike Martin, has insights into both. He's a former British Army officer who's a senior visiting research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he's interested in the evolutionary psychology of warfare in humans, internal conflict in societies, and strategy formation. More recently, Mike has moved into politics and is a parliamentary candidate for the Tunbridge Wells constituency in England, where he'll be standing for the Liberal Democrat Party in the next election. He's had a fascinating career, having served with distinction in the British Army as a political officer in Afghanistan. Since leaving the Army, he's been a senior executive in a global charity that works to bring people and communities together, and he currently runs his own business, advising organisations on how to understand and navigate conflict. Mike's got a book coming out in March called How to Fight a War, which is a guide to understanding modern warfare. Now, I first came across Mike thanks to some Twitter threads that he put out, which explain what's happening in Ukraine in really simple terms. So I've been wanting to get him on the show because I think he's got some fascinating insights that can help explain something we all theoretically understand, but don't really have any practical detailed knowledge of. In our discussion, we explore Mike's career, what drove him to move from the military to war studies, and then on to politics. And he shares some insights into the decision-making around the war in Ukraine and highlights some of the misconceptions that people can have about the realities of war. From there, we move into politics and look at the reasons why Mike's decided to stand for election. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights, so please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Dr. Mike Martin on war and politics. Mike, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Morning.
Look, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I wanted to start off by exploring how you came to look at war studies as a sort of specialist subject. I mean, the path from the military to war studies is obvious, but not everybody does that. And I wondered what got you started on that route.
For me, war is a way of understanding human beings because war is a kind of ubiquitous phenomenon. We've had it since we were living in caves, and unfortunately, I think we're going to have it well into the future. And it touches all societies and all classes. You know, it's as human as sex. And what I think is very interesting about war is it's war per se, but what war does is it shows you the extremes of humanity. So it shows you the very best and the very worst and the very cleverest and the most stupid. And it shows you all of these extremes. And what these extremes do is they illuminate the central human condition. So that's why I study war. And war, in the way that I study it, the way I conceptualize it, it's part of psychology. The way that wars turn out is really driven by human psychology, and it's really rooted in societies as well. War is not an abstract thing that you can study with a spreadsheet and count tanks and whatever. Actually, different societies make wars in different ways, and that tells us something about those societies as well.
And the way that I came across you was on Twitter. And there you've got a wonderful account, which I'll link to in the show notes, where you explain, particularly what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You're providing very, very simple explanations, and you've got a reputation for using what's referred to as crayons, I'm sure digital crayons, to give people a simple illustration as to what's going on. And I found that fascinating because you're simplifying something that's very complex, but you don't just show us pictures or arrows on maps. You're also talking about the psychology behind it. What prompted you to do that?
I can't really claim that it was thought out. It actually started. So I had COVID over the beginning of the Ukraine war. In fact, I caught COVID off somebody the day of the Russian invasion, and then within a couple of days, I was in bed. And so, it wasn't a hugely severe bout of COVID. I had loads of vaccines. But it was sufficient to put me in bed for a week or so. And, when you're in bed and you're not particularly ill, what do? You hang around on Twitter. And what kind of struck me. And, I've fought in wars. So I fought in Afghanistan as an army officer. I've worked in lots of conflict zones, and I've also studied war and written books about it, as well as living and working abroad all over the place. And it seemed to me that the analysis of what was going on wasn't right. So I just started to put together threads. And then that quickly developed into, these maps that you cite. It just became the most easy way to communicate. And it's not, you just go to Google Maps, screenshot it, and then on your iPhone, you've got the paint tools, haven't you? So you can you can just draw what's happening. And that seemed to be the easiest way to describe what was going on. I think just because of my background, I guess I saw things that those in, obviously the reporting comes from the BBC or Sky or whatever. Those guys, the correspondents doing this amazingly brave job in Kyiv or Donetsk or whatever, but they were giving pinpricks of analysis rather than this cohesive whole. What I was trying to provide was a cohesive picture of what was happening. And I felt that the traditional media wasn't necessarily equipped to do that, partly because they had these correspondents out there who were pinpricks, but partly as well because they just didn't have the background and the knowledge and the insight into the psychology of what war is about. And war is one of those things that when you explain it to people, they go, oh, of course that's how it is. Because we're all human beings, right? It's a bit like when you point out something's happening in society or an election happens and everyone goes, oh, well, we all understand why that's happened. Because we're all innately wired to understand human psychology. And war is an expression of human psychology. And so when I'm writing a tweet thread of 30 tweets with a bunch of maps drawn on, iPad Paint or whatever that, bit of the software is called, people read it and go, yeah, oh, that makes complete sense. And then that just seemed to hit a niche that hadn't yet been filled in the marketplace.
And it's that point exactly, because I must admit, I was like, oh, this is the bit that's been missing from the TV news, right? And you say, it's right, that you'll hear that the front has moved, but I'm like, where is that? What's that? And so you get these, but what I thought was interesting was you're talking about, it's almost like, let's take you behind the scenes and say, here's the logic as to why they're doing this, what might happen. And you've put little tweets like, watch this. And you've pointed to little towns that none of us have ever heard of and say, this is a really key location. And so
it's the railway junction or something.
Right. And as you say, the moment you point it out, it's blindingly obvious. And so when you say that, what struck me is that what we've seen in this war is we've seen things that with hindsight, when they're explained to us, are obvious, but there's been a lot of strategic errors, particularly on the Russian side. And I was intrigued by one. On the one hand, you make it sound really simple. On the other hand, why have we got these massive strategic blunders that have, seen the war unfold the way it has?
Well, I mean, it's not just Russia making strategic blunders. Leaders, whether democratic or autocratic or, whether they're monarchs or whatever, leaders have made pretty much the same strategic errors again and again when starting wars. Overconfidence is huge. An inability to see the weaknesses in your own armed forces and an inability to see the strengths in your opponent's armed forces. An inability to see the strategy of the war in a clear and objective way, as an outsider might see it, and very much seeing it from your own perspective. And this is, and this repeatedly happens, which is an over-reliance on new technologies. So war has a kind of immutable logic, right? Strategy first. If you don't have the right strategy, you're not going to win. Doesn't matter how many tanks you've got. Next, logistics and morale. And if you've got those three things, strategy, logistics, and morale, and they're working, you'll probably win that war. But what happens is a new technology will come along. So in the 1920s, it was aircraft, right? Aircraft were going to solve our problems. We didn't need to put troops on the ground anywhere. In 2020, it's cyber warfare. That's going to, solve our problems, and we don't need to send in armored divisions anymore. And unfortunately, the reality is that in order to win a land war, you need ground troops and you need a good strategy, that your army needs to have good morale, and you need to have decent, robust logistics that can survive a war zone. And no matter how good you get at high-end technology, like, direct energy weapons, augmented soldiers, all the rest of it, those three kind of immutable laws of war will still stand. And so there was certainly a feeling that in the West, one of the mistakes the West made was that, well, we need to focus on cyber warfare now. Tanks aren't so important. One of the mistakes that Russia made was to simplify. These big armored columns they put into Ukraine were very heavy on shiny equipment like tanks and artillery, very, very light on infantry. But actually, you need to mix those three things together. You need the infantry protects the tanks protect the infantry. The three of them, infantry, tanks, and artillery, work together. That's pretty much an immutable law in ground combat. Putin ignored that because he thought, well, I can get rid of the infantry and just have, lightly armored forces moving very quickly. But of course, that fell apart. Overconfidence, we're going to get there in 3 days. They didn't get there in 3 days. The armored forces got bogged down. The Ukrainians ambushed them. They didn't have enough infantry to protect their tanks. And then they ended up where they are now.
And have you, as you've been watching this, I mean, you've described it there as sort of history repeating itself, albeit with different dynamics. Mm-hmm. I mean, is it genuinely that's the case, or are there some unique things this time round that have surprised you or are different?
Not really, no. So every war, I could point to almost every war that's been fought, and the commentariat will say, "Oh, warfare's changed. It's completely different now. We need to do X, Y, and Z." And of course, there are lots of people trying to sell technology or new ideas to governments because war is big business as well, right? So they'll come along and say, "We've got this thing that's it's totally changed. Look at that war." I guess I would characterize it in this way. I think there's two things. One is the nature of warfare, which is it's a psychological contest between two brains that have evolved. And that's why we see this, it doesn't matter what technology you have, whether you're throwing rocks or launching hypersonic missiles, it still has, attack, retreat, bluff, deception, ruse, all that stuff that we see. And this is why if you're a military officer, you spend a lot of time studying, you go on battlefield tours to study. And these can be the battles of ancient Greece. They can be the First World War. They're all the same. The dynamics are the same because it's human minds. Obviously, what does change is what you might call the mode of warfare. So different technologies come along. And so drones come along. And that means that we have to think about, okay, so now our tanks need to be equipped with, or in some way equipped with some sort of defensive mechanism against drones. That doesn't mean we need to get rid of tanks, because the reason we need tanks is because they, as we've discussed, they protect infantry, and you need infantry if you're going to win a ground war. So I think people jump to quite quick conclusions and go, well, we don't need tanks anymore because we've got drones now and the tanks are irrelevant. But actually, we still need tanks. We just need to work out how to defend them from drones. So yeah, people are very keen to rush to say, this is totally upended warfare. But actually it hasn't. Warfare still has the same nature. It just, some of the technology involved changes.
And you mentioned presumptions that the world moves on, and there was that classic moment of Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister talking about the fact that, we would effectively, we wouldn't need tanks anymore.
The days of warfare being about armored formations battling it out on the European plains is over, or something.
Right, something
like that. That's
sort of glib statement that's, as with many of his statements, that's turned out not to be entirely correct. And that I think is an interesting example. And you could sort of see, Putin making presumption. And I'm intrigued by this difference between the politicians and the military, because it strikes me that, you can have military, to quote Norman Dixon, I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. People that aren't aware of it, maybe we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But, you can have military incompetence, but you can also have political incompetence. And so it strikes me that there's an interesting thing here where you could have the best military tacticians, but if they're getting, not getting properly funded or getting crappy instructions from on high, that's problematic. And it seemed to me that in the 21st century, that's becoming even more critical now with much more transparency around politics. And I wonder what your thoughts were around sort of political leaders that don't really understand the military.
Well, in some ways, it hasn't changed. It's about having a good strategy, right? To come back to that old adage. And strategy it's not the job of the politicians to sit in a room and promulgate the strategy and the military to follow it. That's not how you form strategy. You form strategy by, in a democratic system, politicians sit down with senior generals and officials around a table, and the politicians will say, there's a conversation, and obviously I'm simplifying a very complicated process here, but the politicians say, we'd like to do X. And the military's job is to turn around and say, we can't do we can't do that. We don't have but if you give us these resources, we could do Y. And the politicians go, Y is not quite right. It's okay, I understand. Okay, but how about if we do Z? And the military go, oh, okay, yeah, we could do that. And so you have this backwards and forwards between vision and resources. I mean, strategy is bringing together ways, ends, and means. So the ends are your goals. The means are how you're going to do it, what resources you have. And the ways are the exact plan. We're going to go left flanking or right flanking. And strategy is bringing together those three things. And if you miss any one of those three, you haven't got a strategy. You've just got a plan, or you've just got, a list of actions to carry out. And it's only through that backwards and forwards between the political level and what you might call the experts, right? Because politicians are not, we don't expect them to be expert in military strategy. We might expect them to have a greater familiarity with strategy. And I'll come back to your question about that in a minute. But it's only through this conversation between the two, vision and expertise, that you end up with a realistic, resourced plan that's rooted in a kind of sound understanding of the world. And so your question is, do we expect politicians, I think, to have this knowledge of war? Obviously, there was a whole generation after the Second World War of politicians who not only had experience of war, but had, often had experience of combat, often were decorated for valor in combat. And that obviously enables the politicians and the experts, the senior generals, to talk in the same language. So they understand each other. They have the same concepts, so they understand each other. I think that's very important. And it is quite hard to understand military strategy in the military without having been in war. Like, it's hard to have that intuitive understanding of the psychology of war without having experienced it. Obviously, it's very difficult for me to do the other side of that hypothesis because I have experienced it. So it's hard for me to say what it's like to, but my observations are that people who have, spent time in war, particularly combat, have an innate understanding of the brutal, ruthless nature of it, the basis of it in psychology. So I do think that there is a huge benefit to that. And I think we're now entering in 2022, we're entering an era where we're much more likely to be heading into, well, we already have a war on the European continent. I think we're much more likely to be heading into some sort of global conflagration over the next 10 or 15 years, because, the international system's broken down. We've got all sorts of problems like climate change, refugees. There's all sorts of tensions building up that we're not really fixing. That usually leads to some sort of war. So I suspect that we don't have the politicians now that are appropriately equipped to navigate us through that war when it comes, if it comes. I suspect that, this is the beauty of a democratic system, is that it tends to produce people at the right time. And you never, right person, right time. And the system tends to produce these people because we have this ability to say that leader's not working, we're going to change. So in that sense, democracy has a huge advantage over autocracies. There's one final thing that I'd like to touch upon, because we've spoken about the politicians and their failings, but actually we also need to speak about the senior military. And I think there's two failings there. One is that in an era of budgetary austerity, senior military sometimes can be reticent about speaking truth to power because they're worried about, they have a very can-do attitude, which is great. That's exactly what we want in our military. And I don't mean this to denigrate the military. I just think it's a reality of the incentives that these senior leaders in the military are placed under. But it means that they're a bit reticent about speaking the absolute truth to power because they're worried about budget cuts. And what that is actually made much worse. That's exacerbated by the fact that in the UK, as in many countries, but particularly in the UK, we have three services: Army, Navy, and Air Force, as everyone knows. But each three of those is really fighting for budget allocations, and the cost of equipment is so much that if the Navy gets a couple of aircraft carriers and then it has to have all the surface ships and the planes to go on them and stuff, that doesn't just sink the Navy's budget for the next decade, it sinks the military budget for the next decade. If the RAF gets new, F-35B fighter jets, which are all singing, all dancing, fantastic bits of kit. Obviously, our aircraft carriers are fantastic as well. That puts a big hole in if the army gets a new, armored, etc. And the problem is that these two things combine, and you end up with a situation where the army says, okay, well, we'll support the RAF to get those fighter jets as long as they support us to get our, armored vehicles. And there's a bit of back scratching, which is, what you'd expect in that system with those incentives. But that's not how you build strategy. Strategy is about starting at the goals that you want to set and then having a discussion about what resources you need and then adjusting your goals, to meet your resources and then having a good plan. That's what strategy is. It's not scratching each other's back because you want to get your equipment programs through. And then you've got all this equipment and there's not really been a discussion of what kind of war we're going to fight or how we're going to fight. And I think you saw that in the integrated review in 2021, which was effectively two things came out of the integrated review. We're going to do, lots of new technology and we're going to cut the infantry, which is never sensible. And also we're going to pivot across the Far East to China, and we're going to, and this is part of global Britain, Brexit, blah, blah, blah. We're going to pivot away from the European theatre, which is absolutely nuts because everybody knows, it's completely obvious to everyone, the Euro-Atlantic area is the core of Britain's defence, and we're a major military power in that area. And that's absolutely where we should be focusing on. And it could be argued that in Putin's mind, when he saw Britain sailing its aircraft carriers over in the South China Sea, he thought, brilliant, these guys have stopped paying attention to Europe. So all of these things have consequences. And I think we just need to think in a lot more hard-headed way about how we go about our strategy and resourcing.
And it struck me as you were talking, there's a natural tendency between politics that has to think in short-term electoral cycles and obviously military planning, that if you think about the length of time it takes to commission things and that's much longer term and requires much longer term strategy. Yeah. So there's this natural tension between those two things. Yeah. And what I thought I heard you saying there was really the military in many respects is forced to play a short-term tactical game, or at least thinks it needs to play that to get to win because it's speaking the language of politicians. Mm-hmm. And actually, we need a bit more longer-term thinking around some of these issues, and that's the challenge here. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that is a good way to look at it. I think there's probably two other things I would say, which is that defense is not really a political issue in the sense that there's broadly cross-party agreement on defense, right? In the way that there isn't on healthcare. And so, for example, everyone agrees that we should be a member of NATO. Everyone agrees that we should have nuclear weapons, although we should pursue multilateral disarmament, etc. And so, in a sense, those cornerstones of defense and security policy don't really change. And so, that to me provides, yes, you're right, the army, the military does need to do that in terms of budgetary cycles, but actually there seems to be fairly, cross-party agreement that we should have, well-equipped expeditionary army. We should be able to project power at the very least in our hemisphere, so Euro-Atlantic and down into Africa and the Middle East. So actually I think there is a basis for longer-term agreement cross-party that should, to my mind, be able to secure budgetary longevity. So I accept what you say, but I don't understand why, because the political system has agreement that could be taken forward.
Right, and it's interesting because I was thinking about sort of the Overton window. For listeners that aren't familiar with that, this is the sort of the range of sort of political discourse and the sort of the where the centre is, I guess. It's interesting that in the UK that seems much more united. As you say, there is a much more consensus. If I looked at, say, Germany, if I look maybe even to the US, we've got other countries that have a much greater difference. So to that extent, the UK is, I won't say it's unique, but from a military planning perspective, it's in a better state than certain other countries might be.
because of that political consensus.
Mm.
It is, I suppose, yes, in that sense, like, every party, I think when Keir Starmer becomes prime minister, because it seems inconceivable that the Conservatives will win the next election with the way they're going on. I don't expect that our Ukraine policy is going to change, for instance. In fact, I expect it to continue exactly the same. I think the big problem in the UK militarily is probably resourcing. And coupled with that, I think there's two problems. I think one is resourcing, and I think the other is that we're not hard-headed enough about our position in the world. The United Kingdom clearly, unarguably, has diminished as a power since 1945. There's no argument about it. And I think for a long time that downward slope was moderated and ameliorated and all the rest of it. And we are a significant country with a well-respected military, but I think we need to decide whether we want to call ourselves a global power militarily, and that requires full spectrum capabilities, right? And so that requires fast jets, nuclear weapons, amphibious assault ships, paratroopers, armored vehicles, expeditionary brigades, so on, all the rest of it, right? It costs a lot of money. There's very, very, very few countries who are able to do that. Arguably, there's only one country that has full spectrum capability in a military sense, and that's the United States. Or do we decide that actually we're a very significant regional power in the Euro-Atlantic area and stretching down into the Middle East and into the African area and the sea lanes around that, and we should focus on that area, and which we could do in a much more significant way, particularly working, with those other major military powers like France in our neighborhood. Particularly working with them, we could have a significant effect in that area. And that is, I think, a question that we've never really settled. I think for a long time, we have told ourselves that we've become a global power, even when it ceased to be true. I'm afraid now it doesn't seem to be true. And I think that is just a reality that we need to accept, but we do have a very significant role in our hemisphere, and that is one that we should embrace and one that we should carry out with the best of our ability. Like, the world is complex and difficult, and we have lots of allies all over the world, and I don't see it as any great sadness that we have to accept that we, with other powers, are going to manage, work to ensure security in these areas of the world, and other powers are going to deal with things that are happening in the other areas of the world. Because the reality is that if we focus on areas that are halfway around the world, we are neglecting our ability to deliver what we must in our neighborhood. It's obviously a large neighborhood, stretches from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from Newfoundland to the Urals. So it's quite a significant chunk of the globe that we need to be able to project power across, in addition to, some other pinpricks like the Falklands and Pitcairn. We obviously have dependent territories elsewhere. But I think this idea that we are still a global military power with full spectrum capabilities, I think if I just look at the structure of the army, it's just simply not true. And the reason, many people will say, well, look, you're just being defeatist and all this kind of stuff. Actually, armies that look good on paper get found out. And that's what Russia has just found out. Their army looked very good on paper, and they've just had their asses handed to them on a plate by the Ukrainians. And so let what's happened to Russia be a lesson to us all. You've got to, I know I always get this phrase wrong, but you've got to cut your cloth to suit your waistline, or whatever the phrase is. whatever the phrase is.
Cut your cloth accordingly. I don't know what it's
There you
according
go.
to, but yeah.
Yeah. You've got to cut your cloth accordingly. And the reality is we are a significant medium-sized power that has a significant regional or hemispheric role, but we are no longer a global power. And that is something that is a discussion that Britain needs to have with itself. And I think, I think Brexit was a symptom of that discussion playing out. I think there's a number of other symptoms of that discussion playing out in our politics. And really, this is the question that I think we're going to be settling over the next 20 years or so internally. And I think we will be in a better place when we settle that question. I think the world will be in a better place when we settle that question as well.
And that naturally takes us to you moving into politics. And again, there's I'm intrigued by, and there's lots of clues in what you just said, but I sort of want to unpick that a little bit in terms of we talked about your shift from the military into your current area of interest, and the shift logically into politics. I mean, it flows from everything you've said. Is that what's driven it? You've sort of started to think about some of these topics in that way, and therefore that's the place you can make a difference. What is it that's driving your political interest and ambitions?
I think at the moment we have a government that, I mean, if you just set aside policy, right? Whether we want a big state or a small state or this tax rate or that tax rate, at the moment we have a government that is largely composed of liars who are, by any definition of the word, there's a lot of corruption going around, people feathering their own nests. And they've largely spent the last 7 years fighting with themselves, various factions. The Tory party's got kind of libertarians who think that we should become Singapore. It's got traditionalists who think we should ban gay marriage. It's just got all these various different factions, and they're all fighting each other. And that's played out over the various visions for the country and the leadership. I mean, if you just think about it, just since 2010, since they've come into power, we've had, we had the big society, didn't we? Then we had austerity. Then we had Brexit. Then we had global Britain. Then we had, briefly, when the Liz Truss, this kind of extreme libertarianism. Now we've got, what have we got now? One nation austerity, or whatever they want to call it. It's just incredible, this sort of shape shifting, and they don't really have a kind of, so they're just not at all competent or honest. So that is a sort of, why am I doing this now? But more broadly, I study war because it teaches me about humans, and I've lived in lots of countries around the world and lots of conflict zones, and so I have an idea about what makes societies tick, what makes societies work, and what makes societies not work. And when I look around the UK, even accepting, everything I've just been discussing, the society's not really working at the moment, actually. It's a bit broken. And a lot of the things, so honesty and competence that we've just spoken about, that's a major factor. But there's also, nobody's really fixing problems. So when a problem comes up, there'll be an announcement on the media. Often what happens is senior leaders will use that particular problem as a way of burnishing their own power, rather than seeing it as a problem that needs to be fixed or a consensus that needs to be, drawn up. So there's a sort of media announcement that's designed to position yourself or put your opponents in a difficult position. So it's all politics and it's no substance. And that, I think, is lacking. And, the longer this goes on, the more it starts to eat into the fabric of society. We already have a political system where lying is normalized. And it's really corrosive, not just to the Conservative Party, because, I spend a lot of time knocking on doors. I knock on doors 2 days a week in my constituency. And it's the favorite part of my job. And it's because it's really interesting, because it's about people, right? I love people. don't ever become a politician if you don't love people, because that's what the job is. And what I find depressing is there's a significant number of people who say that all politicians are the same. So I say, what's your biggest issue? And they say politicians. Or I say, what's your biggest political issue? And they go, politicians. And I go, oh, why is that? And they go, well, because they're all lying and cheating and stealing. And I go, okay. But all of them, I mean, Ed Davey and Keir Starmer, for instance, strike me as, you might think lots of things about them, but they strike me as honest, decent people who are trying to do what they think is the best. And then they go, yeah, that's true, I suppose. But their initial thought is because all they hear on the news is just this sort of constant drip of corruption and people feathering their own nests and sorting out their mates and all the rest of it. That just bleeds across to the whole political system. And I think that's sad, but more than that, I think that's dangerous. Like we have come back to what we were saying earlier, that we might be going into a big global war or conflagration in the next 10 or 15 years. Even if we avoid that, we've still got huge problems. Climate change, international migration, the international system, the UN and all that lot. That's not really functioning. That's broken down. Whether we like it or not, we have a land war in Europe. The international security environment is very, very, very risky. So there's huge problems that need to be managed. And if you have a political system full of people who are focusing on their own careers or sorting out their mates or enriching themselves or just lying, and they're not focusing on fixing problems, and that's very dangerous. That's a very, very dangerous position. Like, we enjoy 1,000 years or 800 years of democracy in this country. Okay, we can make arguments about whether Simon de Montfort's parliament was truly democratic, but you get the point. Like, right. We have a long history here of an evolving political system which has become more and more respectful of the population's wishes. I guess finishing up with the great enfranchisement of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, finishing up with obviously the enfranchisement of women. And that, does that make us complacent? I don't know. I in my studies of other countries, a lot of these things are quite fragile. A lot of these consensuses and rules and norms are quite fragile. And I think that if you have some skills or you have some ideas, then you should get involved in politics. Because if you don't, you vacate the field to charlatans. And that's effectively what's happened. A lot of people, being a politician is if you speak to them, they basically say it's brutal. It's unrelenting. It's horrendous. It's an appalling strain on their families and them. People attack them. I mean, mostly verbally and in the media, but also occasionally, physically. We've had a couple of MPs being killed over the last 5 years. And so most people say, do you know what? I'm just not getting involved in that. Right. I've got drive and I'm whatever. And so I'm just going to go and do something else. But the problem is when you do that is you vacate the field to absolute charlatans. And to a degree, I think that is what's happened now. And we're paying the price. So yeah, that's a little bit, I suppose, about my journey and my motivations.
And I mean, the two things struck me three things in fact struck me. The first one is that the sorts of behaviors that are carried out, if you had that in the military, you wouldn't put up with it, right? So the dishonesty, all of those. So there's a lack of discipline.
Yeah.
In one struck me. The second thing that struck me was that if we saw this thing,
it's values. It's values, right? It's not discipline. Right, it's values. It's basic. It's values.
Very fair challenge. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And the second thing is, if we saw other countries behaving like this, we'd be rightly criticizing them, to tin pot countries and some of the behaviors that we see at the top of the government. I sort of look at and think it's the kind of thing that we would certainly in the past have criticized other countries for and looked at and sneered at them slightly because at least we're a civilized country. And so that struck me, some of the sort of international work that you've done, looked into, and as you point, the fragility.
Who's laughing now though?
Right. Right, and then the third bit that really struck me is that came out of what you were saying was a sense of duty. And if we think about military sort of duty and a sense of service, that seemed to very much come through. And I'll leave you to decide which of any of those you want to grab hold of. But those are sort of three things that came out of what I heard you saying.
I mean, look, I'm not going to go on about duty and service. People can make their own mind up, and they can decide. What I will say is that already running as a candidate, and I'm, doing this full time. I have a 10-month-old. I'm doing this full time, as I say. On the side, I'm running a business, which my wife works a little bit, and so we have enough to put food on the table. So that's all good. And it is a significant strain on our lives as a family. And I mean, that's all I'll say. And I'm not asking for sympathy because I've chosen to do this. I'm a volunteer, right? But I think that the public discourse about politicians all being in it for themselves, undoubtedly, I've just gone about it myself. There are a class of politicians, unfortunately, seem to be running the country at the moment, who are interested. They're either like ideologues like Suella Braverman, or they are corrupt, like, Nadeem Zahawi sorting out his tax affairs whilst he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Boris Johnson getting his mate in at the chair of the BBC. So there is a class of politicians up there who do exhibit these negative characteristics, but not, what I will say to anyone who's listening, the public, not all politicians are like that. There are politicians who are making significant sacrifices, not just to their lives, but actually to their families' lives, right? And they didn't ask to do that. They're just supporting me because we're trying to make things better. And, again, people can make up their own mind about whether that's true or not. But I would just ask people to consider that and to look at each politician and try and judge them and say, well, what camp does that politician fit into? Because they're not all corrupt. And many, many good politicians have decided to leave politics because it's so brutal. And, the public will, elections tend to deliver the outcomes that the public want in the sense of a kind of macro sense, right? In the choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, the public wasn't really enamored by either of them, but they settled for Boris Johnson because they decided that he was the lesser of two evils. And I think, largely that's been proven right. I mean, can you imagine Jeremy Corbyn being in charge during the Ukraine war? It's just absolutely ridiculous. So, in that respect, it's right. But the consequence of that is all the consequences that have stemmed from Boris Johnson's premiership. So, all I would say is that, and it's not for me to go on about my own qualities, that people can judge for themselves, but I would ask that the public judge individual politicians individually rather than lumping them all together as a political class. Because if you say that, you will end up with all politicians being that type of person. You will get what you wish for or what you don't wish for.
Wow. I think that's incredibly powerful. And you're absolutely right. I think everybody's tarred with the same brush, and that's certainly my experience. People I've met, there's a range, and I would echo that sentiment entirely. To bring us to sort of a positive close, tell us about the book that you've written, because I think as people will have picked up, it's thoughtful, intelligent analysis is what you do. And so who have you written it for, and who would you hope would read it?
So it's called How to Fight a War, and it like Ron Seal, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It in plain speak, it talks you through how to form a strategy, how to gather intelligence, how to build up the morale of your forces, how to design a logistics system that works all the way through, land warfare, sea, air and space, information and cyber, and then nukes and biological and chemical. And it's written to the reader. So it's written in the second person, a bit like, and I don't claim I don't claim this level of greatness at all, but it's the way Machiavelli wrote to the prince. It's written to a commander in chief saying, look, this is my advice to you. You should do it like this. And who do I think should read it? Well, as I said, I think we're going to be entering a period of more warfare rather than less. And so there's certainly a lot of people who, and I think we've seen that over Ukraine and maybe over the response to my Twitter feed, who want to understand war, not what I call war porn. They're not interested in the weapons or the blood or the tanks or any of that, but they're interested in the strategy and the psychology and understanding why these things happen, because it's a human phenomenon, yet it's actually quite poorly understood. It's fascinating for such a ubiquitous phenomenon how poorly understood it is. So in that sense, I want to, communicate to the public how I think war should be understood. But more than that, actually, it's a bit of a handbook, right? So if you're a journalist and you don't know anything about war, why would you, right? You can listen, and it's a primer. If you're a politician who's just become an MP, well, you wouldn't necessarily know anything about war. Maybe you work for a charity and then you become an MP, or you've campaigned on health or something. Why would you know anything about war? But you need to know about war if you're a politician. And certainly, if you get into junior ministerial positions, those people need to understand what war is about, because too often they, if we look at how the Ukraine war's been analyzed, people have just been counting tanks and going, oh, well, Russia's going to win because they've got more tanks. But very early on, it was clear that they had a very poor strategy. Their logistics were falling apart and their morale was awful. And a lot of people, now we're openly talking about, the war might go either way, but it took a long time for the media to get there because they were relying on an uneducated understanding of what war was. So, yeah, I think, it's a short book. It's got lots of diagrams. You could read it on a long, on a plane journey or something, or a train journey. And I hope people come away from reading it thinking, I understand war, but actually next time they see the news, they've got a framework for understanding what they're seeing. They can digest that information and go, oh, that's interesting. And they know what questions to ask. They go, but what about the logistics? What's going on there? And so it gives them a framework for understanding this really important human phenomenon, which, as I said, I think is really poorly understood.
And that was the bit that really appealed to me, because I thought I'm not planning on being in a situation where I'm going to need to make decisions, but stuff gets done in my name, and it is relevant. It plays, as you say, it plays itself out like the refugees that might be coming to one's country.
Right? You're a citizen, and you could argue that it's incumbent upon citizens to inform themselves about important issues in their society, right? You do have to make a decision about who you vote for instance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I do think that, we're in a world where we talk about the rights that everyone has, but there's the other side of that, which is responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities of citizenship, and we're all citizens and we get lots from the government, and we give lots to the government in taxes and votes and all the rest of it. But one of the things that perhaps we don't do so well is emphasize that people have responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities is to inform themselves about the world and about the society that they live in, because otherwise they can't contribute to the conversation, the national conversation, and they can't contribute to the political conversation, and they can't, they're not educated in the way that they vote. And I know not everyone's going to do that, but I think, I do think that is incumbent upon people to do.
I think Brexit's a great example of that, right? How many people voted for that without fully understanding it? And even if you had researched
for it,
right?
Yeah, it's complicated. Like, what did I know about the difference between the European Union, the single market, and the customs union before that all came about? I knew nothing about it. Right. Absolutely. So it is complicated. It's yeah. I think a lot of people didn't vote in that referendum, which was sad. Who might have changed the outcome. And I think a lot of people voted that referendum saying, I just did it to poke my finger in the government's eye. That's very sad as well. So
yeah. The other bit I liked in what you do is the sense of curiosity that you spark. Because one of the things I found fascinating about following you on Twitter, sort of listening to you talking, is that you answer questions and then I have a whole load more. And I don't mean because you don't answer the first one. I mean, because it's like, oh, this is a bit, and I guess this is Brexit being a good example. Oh, this is a bit more complicated, right? There's a bit more to this than I recognized. And so I also wanted to sort of put on the record and say thank you for sparking my curiosity, because there's lots of things that I thought it was really, back to your point around looking at military, I'd assumed it was like a game of top trumps, right? So let's just look at the numbers. How do these things stack up, right? Who's got the bigger card? And that's good. And you've suddenly pointed out there's a ton of, depends what you do with it. It depends where these things are and how it works and the morale of the people operating and all those things. And so I love the way that you kind of, certainly when my curiosity has been piqued and I'm like, oh, I've got a load more questions now. So when I see that you've got a thread, I'm always finding I'm reading your stuff and going, but I want more, right? There's more things to do. And I recognize you have other things to do, as you've highlighted. But I think that being curious about the world, and anybody that helps make me more curious about a subject than I was to start with, because they've answered the questions and prompted further thought rather than they haven't answered the questions, which is the classic politician thing that you're not displaying, I think is great. So I wanted to say thank you for that as well. And my sense really is that when you write things down, you're looking to spark people's interest. And so it's not just about answering questions. It's really about that curiosity that I recall from school, where you had a teacher that would inspire you to want to know more about the subject because it had triggered something inside you. And so that for me is I sense a lot of what you're
saying. I'm
doing.
like a child.
No, I'm saying the teacher bringing out the child. Hey, that's
no. I like that childlike curiosity is great. The world's a fascinating place.
Fabulous, as you have demonstrated. Well, look, Mike, I've said it before. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Remind people where you're standing for election. Might as well get that out of the way, and then we'll talk about that.
I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate for Tunbridge Wells. So if you're in Tunbridge Wells listening to this, then you can go to my website, mike-martin.co.uk.
Fantastic. And the book title and when that's coming out?
How to Fight a War. And that's coming out on March the 30th. Available at all good bookstores, including Amazon.
And probably some bad ones as well. Thank you so much for your time and for all the work that you do.
Thanks, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Mike for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Mike, his political works, his book, How to Fight a War, and a link to his Twitter account where he shares fascinating insights, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're a long-time listener and have not yet left a review for the show, please do so. It really does help. Just leave that on whichever platform you're listening on, as it makes the show more visible to other people and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests. Finally, your regular reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out in March, and you can pre-order it now. There's a link to where you can do that in the show notes. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.